At 48, veteran Arthur has just been evicted, left empty-handed with nothing but an old truck and his hard-of-hearing dog, Buster. When a flash flood in Oregon swallows his last hope, Buster leads him to a massive, fallen cedar tree, hiding a technical fortress equipped with advanced floor heating and ingenious insulation. Why does a dead tree hold technology decades ahead of its time? And why did his late father's map lead Arthur to this exact secret? What he uncovers is a stolen legacy and a truth so dangerous that killers are willing to strike to keep it buried. This is a journey of honor, healing, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his four-legged brother. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and hit subscribe to uncover the secrets inside the hollow tree right now. The gray light of a Tacoma December filtered through the grime-streaked windows of the industrial district, where the rain fell with a relentless, mechanical persistence. The air inside the garage was a stagnant cocktail of sawdust and old motor oil, vibrating with the distant, low-frequency hum of the Interstate 5 highway. Arthur stood in the center of the drafty space, his presence as immovable as the heavy oak workbench he had spent the last 3 years refining. At 48, he was a man whose physical form seemed carved from the very timber he worked with, broad-shouldered, thick-boned, and weathered by a life that had demanded too much of his endurance. His face was a map of hard-won experience. A sharp, angular jawline was perpetually shadowed by a dense silver-gray stubble that matched the salt and pepper hair cropped close to his skull. A jagged, pale scar raked across his left temple, disappearing into the crinkles around a pair of flint-colored eyes that rarely stayed still. Those eyes were always scanning, always calculating, a lingering habit from his years as a combat engineer in the Kunar Valley. He wore his uniform of civilian survival, a heavy beige canvas jacket, frayed but impeccably clean, layered over a crisp beige button-up shirt. His pants were dark charcoal chinos, chosen for their smooth, quiet texture. He had long ago abandoned denim, finding the coarse, abrasive feel of jeans against his skin to be an intolerable trigger for the sensory static that lived in the back of his skull. To Arthur, the world was a cacophony of unwanted noise, the screech of brakes, the shrill ring of phones, the hollow chatter of neighbors, all of which merged into a high-frequency buzz he called the ghost. This static made his skin crawl and his heart race, an invisible pressure that only subsided when he was holding a chisel or deep in the silent architecture of a forest. Beside his right leg, Buster remained in a state of watchful repose. The 10-year-old German shepherd was a mirror of his master's weary dignity. His once black muzzle was now heavily frosted with white, and his right ear was a tattered remnant of the explosion that had claimed both Arthur's peace of mind and Buster's hearing. The blast had left the dog in a world of absolute silence, but in that silence, Buster had developed a telepathic sensitivity to Arthur's internal weather. He didn't need to hear a command. He felt the tightening of Arthur's hamstrings, the sharp intake of breath before a panic attack, and the subtle shift in weight that signaled a change in mission. Buster's eyes, a deep and liquid amber, were fixed on the garage's rolling door with a soldier's patience. He was a creature of scars and loyalty, a sentinel who had traded the hunt for the watch, and whose only purpose was to be the anchor for the man who had pulled him from the rubble of a burning outpost half a world away. Together, they were two fragments of a broken machine, held together by shared trauma and a silent, unbreakable pact of protection. The violent rattle of the garage door's handle signaled the arrival of the outside world, a sound that hit Arthur like a physical blow. The door screeched upward, revealing Mr. Henderson, a man whose physical appearance was as unappealing as his temperament. Henderson was a short, squat man, built like a fire hydrant and possessed of a permanent, wine-colored flush across his nose and cheeks. He wore a grease-stained neon puffer vest that strained against his midsection and carried a digital tablet as if it were a weapon of mass destruction. Henderson was the embodiment of the transactional world Arthur loathed, a man who saw people as ledger entries and a veteran's struggle as a mere inconvenience to his profit margins. He didn't look Arthur in the eye. Instead, his gaze darted around the meticulously clean workshop, looking for a reason to be offended. Henderson cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound, and informed Arthur that the redevelopment of the block had moved up its schedule. The grace period was over. The back rent, accumulated while Arthur struggled through a particularly brutal bout of PTSD in the autumn, was now a debt he couldn't pay. Henderson's voice was a grating whine, speaking of market forces and legal entitlements. But all Arthur heard was the static in his head growing louder, a screaming siren that threatened to drown out the reality of the room. He didn't plead, he didn't explain. He simply watched the small, angry man waddle back to his car, leaving the door open to the biting December wind. Arthur turned to his workbench, his fingers trailing over the smooth maple surface. This was his sanctuary, the only place where he felt the ghost recede. The realization that he was once again being displaced didn't bring anger. It brought a profound, hollowed-out clarity. He looked at his tools, the Japanese hand saws with their razor-sharp teeth, the sets of chisels he had forged and tempered himself, and the hand planes that could take a shaving off a board as thin as a butterfly's wing. They were not just tools, they were his therapy, his medicine, his bridge back to a world that made sense. He began the ritual of packing with a methodical, military precision. Every chisel was wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. Every saw was placed into a custom-fitted wooden crate. He moved with a subtle limp, a reminder of the shrapnel that had shattered his knee, but his hands remained steady. He wasn't just packing equipment, he was securing his sanity. The city had tried to digest him for 3 years, offering him nothing but noise and debt. And now, as he loaded the crates into the bed of his 1998 Ford F-150, he felt the first flicker of a different kind of energy. It was the energy of a withdrawal, a tactical retreat into the only terrain that offered a chance at peace. The Ford F-150 was a beast of a machine, a patchwork of rusted red paint and primer. But its engine was a testament to Arthur's skill as a mechanic. It roared to life with a deep guttural growl that vibrated through the concrete floor, a sound that Buster felt through his paws and greeted with a low wag of his tail. Arthur loaded the final crate, a heavy box of dried rations and old military surplus gear, and secured the tailgate. He climbed into the driver's seat, the springs groaning under his weight, and looked at the passenger side. Buster hopped in with a practiced leap, settling his heavy head on Arthur's thigh. The interior of the truck smelled of old leather and tobacco, a familiar, comforting scent that signaled the start of a mission. Arthur didn't look at the pile of discarded scrap wood he was leaving behind, nor did he glance at the flickering fluorescent light that had been his only sun for months. He shifted the truck into gear, his jaw set in a line of grim resolve. He wasn't heading toward a new job or a better apartment. He was heading south, toward the dense, rain-soaked cathedrals of the Oregon old-growth forest. He needed a place where the air was heavy with the scent of pine and decay, a place where the only noise was the wind in the canopy and the only judgment came from the earth beneath his feet. He was a man seeking the silence of the trees to drown out the static of his life. And as he pulled out of the alley and into the gray mist of the highway, Arthur felt the weight of the city begin to slip away, replaced by the cold, honest promise of the wilderness. The drive out of Tacoma was a blur of neon signs and congested traffic. Each honk of a horn and flash of a brake light, a needle prick against Arthur's nerves. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity until the urban sprawl began to thin. The concrete gave way to green, first in patches, then in vast, unbroken waves of Douglas fir and hemlock. As the elevation climbed, the air changed, losing its metallic tang of exhaust and taking on the sharp electric edge of the mountains. Buster remained a steady, warm pressure against his leg, his eyes closed as he drifted into a light sleep, undisturbed by the world he could no longer hear. Arthur felt the phantom static in his brain begin to lose its edge, the high-frequency hum softening into a low, manageable thrum. He wasn't going to the woods to die. He was going to find a way to live without the noise. He was an engineer of survival, a man who knew how to build a bridge or a bunker, and now he was going to build a life out of the silence. As the truck crossed the border into Oregon, the rain turned into a soft, whispering mist, and for the first time in a decade, Arthur allowed himself a single, shallow breath of relief. The war had followed him home, but here, among the ancient giants of the forest, he intended to finally
logging
leave it
road,
behind. A narrow rib of gravel snaking through the Umpqua National Forest was no longer a path. It had become a treacherous, liquefying vein of gray sludge. Arthur fought the steering wheel of the 1998 Ford F-150, as the heavy rain transitioned into a violent, horizontal barrage that turned the windshield into a flickering wall of emerald shadows. The phantom static in his mind, the high-frequency hum of a decade of trauma, was momentarily silenced by the sheer, visceral roar of the Pacific Northwest in its most primal state. He pushed the truck higher into the ridges, his flinty eyes scanning the wall of ancient Douglas firs that thrashed like drowning giants in the gale. Beside him, Buster was a statue of tense muscle. The 10-year-old German shepherd sat with his paws braced firmly against the dashboard, his frosted muzzle twitching as he sensed the low-frequency groans of the mountain through the vibration of the chassis. Buster lived in a world of absolute silence, yet he was the first to feel the Earth's instability, a tectonic warning that bypassed human hearing and resonated directly in his marrow. Before the road ascended into the highest, most exposed reaches of the pass, Arthur spotted a flickering amber light through the mist, the last stop trading post. It was a sagging, cedar-shingled structure that looked as if it were being slowly reclaimed by the moss and ferns. Arthur pulled the truck into the muddy lot, the engine idling with a ragged, uneven pulse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, kerosene, and wet wool. Behind the counter sat Silas Vance, a man who appeared to be carved from a block of seasoned hemlock. Silas was in his late 70s, his face a rugged landscape of deep-set wrinkles and sunspots, his left hand missing the ring and pinky fingers, a grim badge of honor from 40 years in the timber industry. He wore a faded olive wool vest over a salt and pepper flannel shirt, his eyes clouded by cataracts but still holding a sharp, predatory clarity. Silas was a man of long, heavy silences, his voice a gravelly rasp that sounded like river stones grinding together. He watched Arthur's beige canvas jacket and the military-style crates in the truck bed with a weary respect, recognizing the look of a man who was seeking a place where the world couldn't find him. Silas offered a single, ominous warning. The mountain was breathing heavy, a sign that the soil was too saturated to hold. Arthur offered a curt nod, purchased 2 jugs of kerosene with his last few dollars, and returned to the storm. The higher the F-150 climbed, the more the road began to dissolve. The engineering mind in Arthur, the part of him that understood load-bearing capacities and soil density, screamed that the terrain was reaching its breaking point. He watched the runoff turn from clear water to a thick chocolate-colored slurry, carrying stones and debris. Suddenly, a sound deeper than the thunder vibrated through the floorboards, a sickening liquid crump that echoed through the valley. 100 yards ahead, the mountain gave way. A massive stand of firs tilted in a slow, terrifying arc before a wall of mud, boulders, and uprooted forest floor cascaded across the road. Arthur slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding sideways on the slick surface, but the ground beneath the rear wheels was already failing. A flash flood, triggered by a natural dam bursting higher up the ridge, surged down the ravine with the force of a locomotive. The F-150 was seized by a wall of debris-choked water that lifted the 2-ton vehicle as if it were made of paper. The world became a chaotic kaleidoscope of crushing impacts and the deafening roar of water. The Ford spun violently, its passenger side slamming into a massive stump before the front end dived nose first into a widening chasm of mud. Arthur didn't panic. He moved with the cold, lethal efficiency of a man who had pulled brothers from burning wreckage in the desert. "Buster! Out!" he shouted, the words lost to the storm, but the intent clear in his frantic movements. He fought the pressure of the water pinning the driver's door shut, using his shoulder in a desperate lunging heave. The door yielded with a groan of twisting metal, and icy, silt-heavy water flooded the cab, soaking his dark charcoal chinos and beige shirt instantly. Arthur seized the oilcloth-wrapped tool crate, his only connection to a future, and shoved it toward a stable rock shelf above the rising slurry. He then lunged back for Buster, grabbing the dog's harness just as the truck began to slide toward the abyss. With a final, agonizing surge of strength, Arthur heaved the 70-pound dog upward toward the rock before scrambling out himself. He stood breathless, his lungs burning, as he watched the Ford F-150, his only home, get swallowed by the mudslide, rolling into the darkness until only the faint smell of gasoline remained. As the adrenaline began to fade, a blinding, white-hot agony erupted in Arthur's right knee. The violent scramble had twisted the joint where the old shrapnel was still embedded. the freezing rain acting like a conductor for the pain. He tried to stand, but the leg buckled, a sickening pop echoing in the small alcove. He collapsed into the mud, gasping, his fingers clawing at the earth. The beige canvas of his jacket was now a heavy gray-coated weight, and the cold began to settle into his bones with a terrifying, lethargic finality. He looked at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. He was stranded, crippled, and stripped of everything he owned. For a moment, the silence of the forest felt like a shroud. The ghost in his head whispered that he had finally run out of luck, that the wilderness he had sought for healing would instead become his grave. He felt his resolve beginning to fracture, the weight of his failures and his physical agony pressing down on him like the saturated soil of the mountain. Buster, however, was not finished. The old dog shook the muddy water from his coat, his frosted muzzle twitching as he caught a scent that bypassed human perception. He felt the tremors of despair in Arthur's body through the ground, a vibration he had learned to recognize during the darkest nights in Tacoma. Buster approached, his wet fur pressing against Arthur's chest, and began to nudge Arthur's injured leg with his nose. It wasn't a gentle gesture, it was a persistent, demanding heech, a soldier's call to get back on the line. When Arthur didn't move, Buster gripped the sleeve of the beige jacket in his teeth and pulled, his amber eyes fixed on Arthur's with a fierce, ancient clarity. Through the absolute silence of his world, Buster sensed a pocket of stillness nearby, a shift in the air that indicated a natural windbreak. He nudged Arthur's knee again, then turned and took a few steps toward a gap between two basalt pillars, letting out a low, vibrating huff that Arthur felt in his own ribcage. Arthur looked at the dog, then at his tool crate. He couldn't stay here. The shelf was unstable, and the hypothermia was already setting in. Using a thick branch of fallen fir as a makeshift crutch, he forced himself up. The pain was a jagged blade, but Buster's steady presence acted as a north star in the gloom. They began a slow, agonizing trek away from the wreckage. Every step was a battle against the liquefying earth and his own faltering heart. Buster moved ahead, stopping every few yards to ensure Arthur was following, his white frosted muzzle appearing like a ghost in the shadows. He led Arthur through a dense thicket of vine maple that clawed at their faces, and then, quite suddenly, the wind died down. The terrain sloped downward into a hidden, horseshoe-shaped valley, shielded from the worst of the gale. The air here was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and ancient cedar. As they reached the floor of the valley, Arthur saw a massive horizontal shape looming in the darkness, a western red cedar so large it seemed to belong to a different era. He collapsed near the base of the trunk, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as Buster sat beside him, a silent sentinel in the heart of the storm. The fallen monarch lay across the throat of the Horseshoe Valley like a relic from a prehistoric era, its massive roots reaching upward like the calcified fingers of a buried titan. It was a western red cedar, a thuja plicata of such staggering proportions that its diameter surpassed the height of two men standing on each other's shoulders. Even in its death, the tree exhaled a thick, intoxicating aroma of tannin and ancient earth, a scent that acted as a balm to Arthur's frayed nerves. The rain, which had been a violent percussion against his skull for hours, was reduced to a muted whisper by the dense, mossy canopy overhead. Arthur leaned heavily on his makeshift fur crutch, his right knee a screaming knot of fire and jagged bone grind, and watched as Buster approached the trunk with a curious low-slung gait. The old German shepherd didn't bark. Instead, he pressed his frosted white muzzle against a section of the bark where the moss had been disturbed. Buster's amber eyes flickered toward Arthur, his tail giving a single, heavy thud against the wet ferns. Through the absolute silence of his world, Buster had sensed something that Arthur's clouded mind had missed. The tree wasn't just a fallen obstacle. It was hollow, and that hollowness was intentional. Arthur dragged his mangled leg forward, the dark charcoal chinos of his trousers now plastered to his skin with a mixture of freezing mud and blood. He found the entrance near a massive burrow where the trunk flared out. It wasn't a natural decay hole. The edges were too straight, the cuts too deliberate. A heavy panel of bark, reinforced from behind with hand-hewn cedar planks, acted as a camouflaged door. Arthur's large, calloused fingers traced the seams, recognizing the work of a master woodsman. This was the handiwork of Silas Vance, the man from the trading post, or perhaps a younger version of him. As Arthur pushed the door open, the hinges fashioned from thick oil-treated leather swung with a silent grace that spoke of meticulous maintenance. The interior was a revelation of frontier engineering. Silas had not merely found a hollow tree, he had excavated it, using the natural rot of the cedar's core to create a long, cylindrical gallery that stretched nearly 40 feet into the heart of the log. The air inside was dry and carried the faint, lingering warmth of a space that had been built to defy the elements. As Arthur collapsed onto the floor of the entrance, the phantom static in his brain began to subside, replaced by a singular survivalist focus. He was a combat engineer, a man who understood that a fortress was only as strong as its weakest seal. He looked at his tool crate, the oilcloth-wrapped legacy he had nearly died to save, and knew that his first mission was to secure this sanctuary before the atmospheric river turned the valley into a lake. He ignored the throbbing agony in his knee, his mind drifting back to a memory of Sergeant Elias Doc Miller, the senior medic in his old unit. Doc Miller had been a man of terrifying efficiency, a tall, gaunt figure with skin like tanned leather and eyes that seemed to have seen every possible way a human body could break. Miller used to say that hope is a luxury, but preparation is a requirement. Doc had been the one to patch Arthur up after the IED, his long, steady fingers moving with a cold, clinical precision, even while mortar rounds shook the earth. Arthur channeled that memory now, treating his own survival as a tactical problem to be solved with the materials at hand. The structure was solid, but the years of neglect had allowed moisture to seep into the secondary seams where Silas had expanded the interior. Arthur knew he needed to act fast. He reached for a small iron pot from his crate and a tin of harvested pine resin he had purchased from Silas earlier. He crawled toward the small stone hearth Silas had built near the center of the log, a sophisticated venting system that utilized a hollowed-out branch as a natural chimney. Arthur sparked a small flame using a piece of charcloth, his fingers steady despite the tremors of exhaustion. As the fire took hold, he began the arduous process of melting the pitch. He took strips of thick cedar bark he found stacked in a corner, likely Silas's reserve, and began to heat them. Once the resin was a viscous, bubbling black liquid, he applied it to the gaps in the wood, layering the bark over it like shingles. The smell was sharp and medicinal, the resin acting as a waterproof adhesive that bonded the new bark to the ancient trunk. He worked with the rhythmic focus of a man possessed, his beige canvas jacket stained with pitch and earth, his dark charcoal chinos torn at the knees. He was no longer a homeless veteran. He was a builder once more, reclaiming his dignity through the honest labor of his hands. Insulation was only half the battle. As the storm outside intensified, the air in the valley became electric. Thunder rolled across the ridges, and the sky flickered with the blue-white glare of mountain lightning. For Buster, this was a time of extreme distress. Although the dog was deaf, he was hypersensitive to the barometric pressure and the static electricity that preceded a strike. Buster began to pace the narrow confines of the log, his paws clicking nervously on the wooden floor, his body trembling with a tension that Arthur felt through the soles of his boots. Arthur remembered the Faraday cage experiments from his engineering days, the principle that a conductive enclosure could block external electric fields. He looked around the log and spotted a roll of rusted but intact steel mesh tucked behind Silas's old workbench, likely intended for sifting soil or protecting a garden from rodents. Arthur's knee buckled as he stood, sending a white-hot flare of pain through his hip, but he gritted his teeth and dragged the mesh into the center of the living area. He began to fashion a low, dome-like structure near the hearth. He used his heavy wire snips to cut the mesh, the metal groaning as he bent it into a protective arc. He reinforced the frame with supple willow branches he had dragged inside earlier, lashing them together with strips of parachute cord from his pack. He didn't just build a crate, he built a sanctuary within a sanctuary. He lined the bottom of the mesh dome with his own wool blanket, the one he had intended for the truck. As a particularly violent crack of thunder shook the log, Arthur nudged Buster toward the cage. The dog hesitated, his frosted muzzle twitching. But as he stepped inside the grounded mesh structure, the frantic trembling in his limbs began to cease. The cage acted as a shield against the static charge in the air, a quiet zone in a world of electric chaos. Buster let out a long, shuddering sigh and curled into a tight ball, his amber eyes finally losing their frantic glint. Arthur slumped back against the curved wall of the cedar, the warmth from the hearth finally beginning to seep into his bones. He looked around the log fortress and saw more than just a shelter. On a small, hand-carved shelf, he noticed a weathered photograph in a simple pine frame. It showed a younger Silas, standing proudly beside a woman with a bright, defiant smile and hair the color of autumn wheat. This was Elena, the woman whose name Arthur had seen carved into the doorframe earlier. She looked like a person of immense spirit, someone who could turn a hollow tree into a home. The presence of her image made the fortress feel less like a bunker and more like a cathedral of memory. Arthur realized that Silas hadn't built this place just to hide. He had built it to protect what he loved. The ingenuity of the vents, the precision of the bark shingling, the hidden storage beneath the floorboards. It was all a testament to a mind that refused to let the world break it. As the night deepened, the storm's roar became a distant, rhythmic hum, much like the engine of his lost Ford. Arthur took a piece of dry cedar and his smallest carving knife. His hands, though scarred and stiff from the cold, began to move with a newfound purpose. He wasn't carving anything complex, just a smooth, rounded handle for a new crutch. But the act of creating something out of the raw material of his sanctuary felt like a victory. The ghost in his head, the screaming static of his past, was finally quiet. In the heart of a fallen tree, surrounded by the ghosts of another man's life, and protected by his own engineering skills, Arthur found the first thread of a new story. He wasn't just surviving the wrath of the forest. He was becoming part of it. He looked at Buster, sleeping peacefully in his handmade cage, and for the first time in years, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to name: hope. The temperature in the Horseshoe Valley plummeted as the atmospheric river moved eastward, leaving behind a crystalline, biting stillness that seemed to shrink the very fibers of the fallen cedar. Inside the hollowed trunk, the air had grown thin and sharp, smelling of ancient frost and the lingering scent of the resin Arthur had used to seal the seams. He woke to a world of absolute silence, his breath blooming in a thick white cloud before his eyes. His right knee was no longer just an ache. It was a frozen anchor, the old shrapnel feeling like a jagged piece of ice embedded deep within the bone. He lay there for a moment in the dim, pre-dawn light, his dark charcoal chinos stiff with dried mud and his beige canvas jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. The ghost in his head was quiet, suppressed by the sheer physical demand of staying warm. Beside him, Buster was a coiled spring of fur and muscle, his frosted white muzzle tucked beneath his tail. Even in sleep, the old shepherd was attuned to the temperature, his body shivering in short, rhythmic bursts to generate heat. Arthur knew that if he didn't solve the problem of the cold now, the sanctuary would become a tomb. He sat up with a groan, the grit in his knee joint sounding like a dry hinge, and began to scan the interior of Silas's fortress for the materials he needed to turn this wooden tube into a functioning home. Arthur's engineering mind, trained in the brutal improvisations of war-torn landscapes, began to map out the interior. He remembered seeing a hidden cache of materials beneath a loose floorboard near Silas's old workbench. He dragged himself across the cedar floor, his fingers prying up the heavy planks to reveal a treasure trove of discarded industrial history. There, coiled like a copper snake, was a length of old half-inch plumbing pipe, its surface oxidized to a dull, mottled green. Beside it lay a collection of flat, smooth river stones, basalt and granite, that Silas must have hauled up from the creek bed over many years. It was exactly what he needed. His mind flashed back to Caleb Mason, a sergeant he had served with during his second tour. Mason had been a man of immense proportions, a mountain of a human with a thick flame-red beard that smelled of tobacco and soldering flux. Mason was a master plumber by trade who could make water run uphill if he had enough duct tape and spite. He was a jovial giant, always laughing at the absurdity of their missions, but his eyes were sharp and calculating when it came to fluid dynamics. Mason had once rigged a makeshift radiant heating system for a freezing observation post using nothing but scavenged copper from a bombed-out villa and a diesel stove. "Artie," Mason had said, his voice a deep, resonant boom that vibrated in Arthur's chest. "The secret to survival isn't just making fire. It's making the fire work for you. You don't want to heat the air. You want to heat the bones." Arthur took that lesson to heart as he began to clear a space near the center of the log. He used his heavy wood chisels to carve a shallow trench into the cedar floor, circling the area where he had constructed his sleeping platform. His large calloused hands moved with a cold, focused precision, the pain in his knee acting as a motivator rather than a hindrance. He began to bend the copper pipe, using a notched branch as a crude mandrel to prevent kinking. It was backbreaking work, requiring him to use the weight of his entire body to shape the stubborn metal into a serpentine coil. He felt the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, despite the freezing air, his beige shirt dampening beneath his jacket. Buster watched him with a curious tilted head, his amber eyes following every movement. The dog sensed the urgency, occasionally approaching to sniff the copper or to nudge Arthur's hand with his white muzzle. A silent gesture of encouragement that Arthur acknowledged with a brief, firm pat on Buster's notched ear. This was their language, no words, just the shared vibration of effort and the mutual understanding of the mission. Once the trench was carved and the pipe was laid, Arthur began to construct the heart of the system, the stone stove. He meticulously stacked the flat basalt stones he had found. Using a mixture of damp clay and wood ash as a primitive mortar, he built the stove small but dense, knowing that the thermal mass of the rocks would hold heat long after the flames died down. He integrated the inlet and outlet of the copper coil into the base of the stonework, creating a closed-loop system that would theoretically circulate warmed air, or perhaps water, if he could find a way to seal the joints beneath his bed. As he worked, a small, dark-furred marten appeared at the edge of the log's entrance, its black eyes peering in with a mixture of fear and curiosity. It was a fragment of the forest's life, a silent witness to Arthur's reclamation of the space. Arthur ignored the creature, his focus entirely on the engineering of the hearth. He routed the chimney pipe Silas had previously installed into the top of his new stone stove, ensuring the seal was airtight with more of the pine resin he had melted the night before. The physical toll was immense. By the time the stove was finished, Arthur's hands were stained with soot and clay, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. He knelt before the small opening of the hearth, his dark charcoal chinos caked in dust. He took a handful of dry cedar shavings, the waste from his carving, and sparked a flame. The fire caught quickly, the orange light dancing across the curved walls of the log and reflecting in Buster's watchful eyes. As the stones began to warm, Arthur sat back on his heels, watching the smoke draw perfectly upward into the chimney. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the heat began to transfer. He could feel the warmth radiating from the stones, and then, a few minutes later, the floorboards surrounding his sleeping platform began to lose their icy bite. The copper pipes were doing their job, conducting the heat from the hearth and distributing it precisely where his body needed it most. It wasn't just a stove, it was a life support system. The relief was physical and immediate. Arthur crawled onto the platform, his muscles finally beginning to unclench as the radiant heat seeped into his stiffened joints. He shrugged out of his heavy beige jacket, revealing the simple beige shirt beneath, and stretched out his right leg. The warmth from the floor acted like a poultice on his mangled knee, softening the sharp edges of the pain. Buster didn't hesitate. The old dog approached the platform, his heavy paws thumping softly on the warmed wood, and lay down beside Arthur's leg. He placed his heavy, frosted chin directly onto Arthur's shin, his body letting out a long, vibrating sigh of contentment. This was how they communicated now, through the direct conduction of warmth and the steady rhythmic pulse of their heartbeats. In the absolute silence of the log, with the storm still whispering outside and the fire humming in the stone hearth, Arthur felt a profound sense of alignment. He had taken the broken pieces of Silas's legacy and combined them with the lessons Mason had taught him in a different war. He had built a fortress not out of stone and steel, but out of memory, engineering, and the refusal to let the cold win. He closed his eyes, the ghost in his head finally falling into a deep, dreamless sleep, anchored to the world by the heat of the stones and the weight of the loyal dog at his feet. The first light of a winter dawn struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of the Umpqua, filtering into the hollowed cedar as a pale, ethereal glow. Inside, the stone stove Arthur had constructed the previous day hummed with a soft, residual warmth, the copper pipes beneath his sleeping platform radiating a steady heat that kept the biting frost at bay. Arthur sat on the edge of the wooden dais, leaning forward to massage his right knee. The joint felt stiff, a dull ache reminding him of the shrapnel still lodged there. But the radiant heat had prevented the usual agonizing lockup. He was dressed in his beige button-up shirt, the fabric clean but creased from sleep, and his dark charcoal chinos, which were now dry but stained with the gray silt of the landslide. He reached for his beige canvas jacket, pulling it on to ward off the morning chill that lingered near the entrance. Beside him, Buster was not in his usual state of post-dawn lethargy. The old German shepherd, his white frosted muzzle low to the ground, was intensely focused on a shadow-filled corner at the far end of the log's interior, past Silas's old workbench. Buster's amber eyes were wide, and his paws began to rhythmically scrape at the soft, compacted mulch and cedar dust that had accumulated between two protruding root burls. Arthur watched him, a slight frown creasing his scarred temple. Buster didn't dig without reason. His deafness had sharpened his other senses to a point where he could feel the subtle shifts in the earth's density. Arthur grabbed his makeshift crutch and limped toward the dog. "What is it, Buster?" he whispered, his own voice sounding foreign in the absolute silence of the sanctuary. Buster didn't look up. He only dug faster, his powerful shoulders bunching under his coat. Arthur knelt beside him, his charcoal chinos pressing into the soft earth, and used a small hand trowel from his tool crate to assist. A few inches down, the metal struck something solid and resonant. It wasn't stone or wood, it was tin. Together, they unearthed a rectangular box about the size of a field humidor, sealed heavily with layers of blackened beeswax to protect it from the damp. Arthur carried the object back to the warmth of the hearth, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He used his carving knife to slice through the wax, the seal yielding with a stubborn snap. When he pried the lid open, the scent of old paper, dried tobacco, and military-grade gun oil filled the small space. A scent that acted like a sensory trigger, pulling Arthur back to a world he had tried so hard to leave behind. Inside the box lay a stack of yellowed journals bound in twine, a tarnished silver-framed photograph, and a heavy leather-bound ledger. Arthur reached for the photograph first. His breath hitched in his throat, a sudden sharp intake of air that felt like a physical blow. The photo depicted two men in worn combat fatigues, standing before a jagged mountain range that looked hauntingly like the ridges of the Kunar Valley, though the uniforms belonged to a different era. On the left was a younger Silas Vance, his face less lined but possessing the same flinty, uncompromising stare. But it was the man on the right that made Arthur's hand tremble. It was his own father, Thomas Sterling. Thomas was a man of lean, hungry intensity, his jawline as sharp as a bayonet, and his eyes possessing a deep-seated loyalty that Arthur remembered from his childhood. In the photo, Thomas was holding a radio handset, his expression one of weary relief. Arthur's father had been a signals operator, a man who lived in the static, much like Arthur did now. Thomas had died when Arthur was 20, taking to his grave the story of a ghost engineer who had saved his life during a disastrous retreat, a man who had been branded a traitor and a deserter by the very high command he had served. Arthur set the photo down on the stone stove and reached for the journals. As he began to read Silas's dense, slanted handwriting, the pieces of a century-old puzzle began to lock into place. The entries detailed a specific classified engagement known as the Incident at Blackwood Ridge. Silas hadn't deserted his unit. He had been ordered by a man named Colonel Marcus Thorne to secure a cache of sensitive intelligence documents and move them to a secondary location after Thorne's own tactical blunder had compromised their main outpost. Thorne was described in the diary as a man of aristocratic bearing and limitless ambition, a broad-shouldered officer with a thin, manicured mustache and eyes that viewed his soldiers as expendable pawns in a larger political game. When the retreat turned into a massacre, Thorne had panicked. To cover his own incompetence and the loss of the outpost, he had officially declared Silas a deserter, claiming Silas had fled with the documents and abandoned his brothers in arms. The truth, etched in Silas's unwavering hand, was that Silas had stayed behind in the chaos, dragging a wounded Thomas Sterling through 2 miles of enemy-held territory, before hiding the documents here, in this very Thung Lung, intending to return and clear his name once the heat of the scandal had died down. But Silas never could. The documents, proof of Thorne's negligence and the innocence of the men he had sacrificed, were the military secrets Silas had spent the rest of his life protecting. Silas had chosen this hollowed-out tree not just as a home, but as a vault, He had lived in the shadows of the forest, branded a coward, while the man he saved, Arthur's father, had spent decades searching for the man who had pulled him from the fire. Arthur felt a wave of profound, solemn irony wash over him. He had fled the noise of the city to escape his own ghosts, only to stumble into the sanctuary of the one man who held the key to his family's honor. The phantom static in Arthur's head didn't just quiet, it transformed into a singular, vibrating purpose. He wasn't just a squatter in a dead tree. He was the final sentry of a legacy that had been buried for 50 years. He looked at Buster, who had rested his head on Arthur's knee, his amber eyes watching the flickering fire. Buster had felt the vibration of the box in the earth, a silent call from one soldier to another. As Arthur delved deeper into the ledger, he found a hidden compartment in the back of the book. Inside was a thick envelope addressed to whoever finds the end of the trail. It contained a series of official transcripts and signed affidavits from other survivors of Blackwood Ridge, men who had been intimidated into silence by Thorne's influence. Silas had collected them over a lifetime of quiet, persistent investigation. The documents were a weapon, a means to dismantle the lie that had defined Silas's existence. Arthur realized that Silas hadn't died in bitterness. He had died in preparation, waiting for someone with the engineering mind to understand the fortress and the moral weight to carry the truth back to the world. Arthur traced the scar on his temple, his mind drifting to the man he had seen at the trading post. Silas Vance was gone now, but his silence was no longer empty. It was a bridge. The weight of the discovery settled in Arthur's chest, a mixture of grief for the years Silas had lost, and a fierce burgeoning hope for what could be restored. He looked around the log, seeing it now for what it truly was, a monument to persistence. The stone stove, the copper pipes, the hand-hewn bark seals, they were all manifestations of a man who refused to be erased. Arthur realized that his arrival here wasn't an accident of the storm. It was an alignment of destinies. He stood up, his knee groaning but holding firm, and walked to the entrance of the log. The forest was waking up, the birds beginning their morning chorus, the air sharp and clean. He looked out at the Horseshoe Valley, the place where Silas had chosen to stay so that the truth might survive. Arthur knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay hidden forever. The ghost Silas had carried was now Arthur's to release. He would stay here, refine the fortress, and wait for the snows to clear. But when he left this forest, he wouldn't be the broken man who had entered it. He would be the voice of Silas Vance, and he would carry the light of the truth back into the static of the world. He turned back to the hearth, Buster following at his heels, and began to carefully repack the tin box, securing the journals and the photograph as if they were the most delicate pieces of ordnance he had ever handled. The mission had changed. The retreat was over. The counteroffensive had begun. The rhythmic dripping of snowmelt from the towering western red cedars created a chaotic, liquid percussion against the roof of the log fortress. Yet inside the hollowed trunk, a heavy, profound silence reigned. Arthur sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, the radiant heat from the copper pipes beneath him a faint but steady comfort against the biting Oregon morning. He was dressed in his simple beige button-up shirt and dark charcoal chinos, the fabric of his trousers still bearing the faded streaks of the mountain's mud, a stark contrast to the clean, oil-finished cedar floor. His beige canvas jacket lay across his lap, its pockets heavy with the tin box he had unearthed the day before. The journals of Silas Vance sat on the small stone hearth, their pages filled with a truth that had already begun to rewire the neural pathways of Arthur's traumatized mind. But as the phantom static in his head hummed with a new, directional frequency, a nagging intuition began to claw at the edges of his consciousness. Silas's story was only half of the bridge. To understand why the forest had summoned him, a broken engineer seeking a grave, he had to look into the cargo he had carried with him from the garage in Tacoma. He limped toward the back of the log where his own tool crates were stacked, his right knee letting out a sharp, audible pop that vibrated through his charcoal chinos. He reached for a specific chest, one that stood apart from his modern Japanese saws and precision planes. It was a heavy, blackened oak box with sterling etched into a brass plate that had long since lost its luster. This had been his father's chest, a relic from Thomas Sterling's post-war life as a civilian electrician. Arthur's large, calloused fingers traced the dovetail joints, his mind drifting back to a memory of Evelyn Sterling, his mother. She had been a woman of delicate features but ironclad resolve, her hair the color of midnight, and her eyes a piercing, observant blue that seemed to see through Arthur's childhood lies. Evelyn had been the one to insist Arthur keep this chest after Thomas passed away in the winter of 1997, her voice a soft but firm whisper as she told him that some legacies aren't meant to be used, only guarded. She had been a librarian by trade, a woman who treated books and secrets with the same reverence, and she had spent her final years staring out the window of their small house as if waiting for a radio signal that never came. She had never spoken of Silas Vance by name, but she had often mentioned the man in the green cathedral who had given Thomas his life back. Arthur pried open the lid of his father's chest. The interior smelled of ozone and ancient linseed oil. He began to systematically remove the contents: old voltage meters, spools of cloth-wrapped wire, and a collection of hand-drawn circuit diagrams. Near the bottom, tucked beneath a false floor that Arthur had never bothered to investigate during his years of nomadic survival, he found a weathered leather pouch. Inside was a letter, the ink faded to a ghostly brown, and a small tattered fragment of a topographical map. As Arthur unfolded the paper, his heart performed a slow, sickening roll in his chest. The map fragment depicted this exact horseshoe valley, marked with a tiny, precise X in his father's handwriting. The letter was dated August 14th, 1995, 2 years before Thomas died. Thomas had written it during a period of terminal clarity, his hand trembling, but the message unmistakable. He spoke of Silas Vance not as a ghost, but as a blood brother. He wrote of his failed attempts to find Silas, of how the wolves of the High Command had blocked every inquiry, and how he had finally pinpointed Silas's location through a series of cryptic letters Silas had managed to smuggle out through a sympathetic logger decades ago. Arthur, the letter read, the words hitting like a physical weight. If you are reading this, the static has probably found you too. The Sterling men have always been haunted by the signals we couldn't send. I couldn't reach him in time to pay the debt, but I'm leaving the trail for you. Find the man in the trees. Tell him I never stopped looking. Tell him the documents are the only thing that matters. Arthur collapsed back against the cedar wall, the paper rattling in his shaking hands. The realization was a sudden, violent illumination. He hadn't come to this forest by accident. He hadn't been lost in the storm. Subconsciously, or perhaps guided by a deep-seated survival instinct he inherited from Thomas, he had followed his father's unfinished mission. The phantom static wasn't a symptom of his brokenness. It was a homing beacon. He was living in the very legacy of the man who had dragged his father through a valley of death, and he was doing so because Thomas had spent his last breath ensuring the trail remained open. Beside him, Buster gave a low, questioning huff, the vibration traveling through the wooden floor and into Arthur's hip. The old German shepherd, his white frosted muzzle resting on his paws, watched the paper with a focused amber gaze. Buster felt the shift in Arthur's pulse, the sudden spike in adrenaline that signaled a change in the internal weather. Arthur reached out and buried his hand in the thick fur of Buster's neck, the tactile connection grounding him. He realized that the fortress Silas had built wasn't just a shelter for a fugitive. It was a waiting room for a debt that had been overdue for half a century. The irony was a jagged blade in his soul. Arthur had spent years resenting his father's silence, resenting the way Thomas had withdrawn into himself after the war, never realizing that Thomas was engaged in a desperate, silent battle to preserve a truth that could save them both. The beige canvas of Arthur's jacket felt heavier now, as if the weight of 2 generations of soldiers had been stitched into the seams. He wasn't just a carpenter hiding from the world. He was the executor of a century-old will. He looked around the log, seeing Silas's handiwork, the stone stove, the intricate bark seals, not as the work of a stranger, but as the home of the man who was essentially his surrogate grandfather. The debt Silas had incurred by saving Thomas had been paid by Silas's own exile, and now the circle had closed. Arthur realized that his own PTSD, his inability to function in the noisy world, was the very thing that had qualified him to find this place. Only a man who understood the language of silence could find the man who had mastered it. He took the map fragment and Silas's journal, laying them side by side on the hearth. They matched perfectly. The X on Thomas's map sat directly over the location of the hollowed-out tree. The letters that had been lost for years in his father's toolbox weren't lost because of negligence, but because the world wasn't ready for the truth they held. The bitterness of his life as a struggling laborer, the exhaustion of the warehouse floors, and the shame of the eviction. All of it felt like a necessary trial, a shedding of unnecessary skin before he could enter this green cathedral. As the sun climbed higher, casting long emerald shafts of light through the gaps in the canopy, Arthur felt a profound sense of purpose crystallize within him. The ghost in his head didn't just quiet, it stood at attention. He wasn't just surviving, he was occupying a position. He looked at the photo of Silas and Thomas, their young, battle-worn faces now seeming to watch him with a silent, expectant approval. He knew the mission now. He would winter here, refining the system Silas had built, and he would study the documents until he understood every thread of the betrayal Marcus Thorne had woven. He would not just clear Silas's name, he would finish the signal his father had spent a lifetime trying to send. He stood up, his knee groaning, but his posture straighter than it had been in years. He reached for his carving tools, his hands steady as he prepared to engrave a new line into the cedar wall. He wasn't a fragment anymore, he was a continuation. He looked at Buster, and the old dog gave a single, firm wag of his tail, his amber eyes reflecting the fire in the hearth. The sterling debt was finally being collected, and the forest, for the first time, felt like home. The silence of the Horseshoe Valley, once a protective shroud for Arthur's fractured mind, was shattered not by a sound, but by a vibration that only a creature tuned to the earth could detect. It began as a faint, rhythmic thrumming in the floor of the hollowed cedar, a pulse that traveled through the ancient wood and into Buster's resting paws. The 10-year-old German shepherd, whose frosted white muzzle had been resting peacefully on Arthur's dark charcoal chinos, suddenly bolted upright. His notched ear didn't perk. It couldn't. Nhung tuan than chu cho kang kung hu mot soi dai jan. Joy mat mau ho fach xoai sao vao loi vao qua than ke. Arthur, dressed in his beige button-up shirt and pulling on his beige canvas jacket, felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately. The phantom static in his head, which had been replaced by the purposeful hum of his father's legacy, suddenly spiked into a sharp, tactical clarity. He didn't need to hear the snapping of twigs or the low murmur of voices to know that the sanctuary had been compromised. He reached out, his calloused hand steadying Buster with a firm touch on the neck, as he peered through the camouflaged bark door. The forest outside, a cathedral of emerald and mist, had birthed two figures who did not belong to the order of the trees. The leaders of this intrusion were not hikers lost in the storm, but men who moved with the calculated predatory grace of professionals. Leading the way was Captain Elias Reed, a man in his mid-50s whose appearance was a study in cold military precision. Reed was tall and lean, his silver-gray hair cropped into a brutal buzz cut that revealed a thin white scar running along the base of his skull. His face was a landscape of hard-won authority, with eyes the color of frozen slate that seemed to calculate the tactical value of every shadow. He wore a high-end hunting parka in muted forest tones, but beneath the civilian exterior, the outline of a tactical vest and a holstered sidearm was unmistakable. Reed was a man of absolute discipline, a mercenary who had traded his commission for the lucrative shadows of corporate retrieval contracts. Beside him walked Kalen, a wiry man in his early 30s with a restless, twitchy energy. Kalen was the tracker, his skin pale and marked by a faded tattoo of a coiled serpent on his neck. He carried a high-frequency metal detector and a tablet displaying barometric maps, his lip curling into a sneer as he scanned the base of the ancient trees. Kalen was the kind of man who thrived on the hunt but lacked the stomach for the stand, a contrast to Reed's immovable resolve. Arthur watched them from the shadows of the log, his breath held in a slow, controlled rhythm. He heard the faint metallic ping of Kalen's sensor as it swept over a patch of ground near where Arthur had escaped the landslide. "The signal is strongest here, Captain." Kalen's voice drifted through the mist, thin and arrogant. "Thorne's black box is in this valley. Silas Vance didn't take it to the grave. He hid it in the roots." Reed didn't answer immediately. He simply stood in the center of the clearing, his slate eyes scanning the fallen giant of the western red cedar. Arthur felt a cold jolt of realization. These were the wolves his father had warned him about, the agents of Marcus Thorne, still seeking to erase the evidence of their master's ancient betrayal. They weren't looking for a man. They were looking for the tin box currently tucked into the corner of Arthur's tool crate. Arthur's right knee gave a sharp, agonizing twinge as he shifted his weight, the shrapnel grinding against the bone. But he gritted his teeth, the pain acting as a cold fire in his veins. He wasn't just defending a tree, he was defending the honor of two dead soldiers who could no longer fight for themselves. Knowing his physical limitations, Arthur realized he could not engage these men in a direct confrontation. His limp was too pronounced, and he was outnumbered and outgunned. However, he was an engineer of war, a man trained to turn the environment into a weapon. As the men moved deeper into the valley to scout the perimeter, Arthur began his counteroffensive. He moved with a silent, pained urgency, gathering lengths of thin, high-tensile fishing line and rusted wire from Silas's workbench. He spent the next 3 hours in a fever of construction, his hands moving with the muscle memory of 100 field exercises. He didn't build traps meant to kill. He built a sophisticated network of early warning and deterrence systems. He fashioned a series of vibration-sensitive tripwires made of nearly invisible line, anchored to suppler cedar branches and weighted with old iron bolts. He routed these lines through the hollow core of the log, connecting them to a set of hanging brass bells he found in Silas's kitchen. This was his vibration warning system, a way for the log itself to communicate the enemy's position to both him and the deaf Buster. Beside the log, Arthur dug shallow pits, camouflaging them with latticework of vine maple and a layer of damp moss. Inside, he placed log deadfalls, heavy sections of hemlock suspended by tension-release triggers that would swing down with bone-shattering force at knee height, designed to incapacitate trackers without ending a life. He used the resin he had melted for the bark seals to create slick trap surfaces on the basalt rocks leading to the log's entrance, ensuring any hurried approach would end in a dangerous slide. Arthur's dark charcoal chinos were soon caked in fresh earth, and his beige shirt was damp with the sweat of his labor. But he didn't stop. He was weaving a web of defense around his sanctuary, treating the fallen cedar like a bunker in a hostile valley. Buster watched him throughout the process, the old dog sensing the shift from survival to combat. Buster followed Arthur's lead, his amber eyes never leaving the entrance, his paws resting on the copper-heated floorboards where he could feel the slightest discord in the earth's rhythm. As the sun began to dip behind the serrated ridges of the Umpqua, casting long, bruised shadows across the Horseshoe Valley, Arthur returned to the interior of the log. He took a heavy wooden bar Silas had fashioned and slid it into the iron brackets of the door, sealing them inside. He sat on the floor, his back against the curved wall, and reached for a long, heavy iron pry bar he had sharpened into a makeshift spear. The phantom static in his head was now a single, low-frequency hum of readiness. He wasn't the broken man who had fled Tacoma. He was a sentry on the line. He looked at Buster, who had settled into his handmade Faraday cage, the dog's white muzzle resting on Arthur's boot. The first ping of the vibration system came just as the first stars appeared, a sharp, rhythmic strike against the side of the log that translated into a dull thud beneath Arthur's hip. The guests were returning, and they were no longer just searching the woods. They were coming for the tree. Arthur took a deep, steady breath, the scent of cedar and wood smoke filling his lungs, and prepared to show Captain Reed that some legacies were guarded by more than just shadows. The sleet that had been a rhythmic tapping against the western red cedar's thick bark turned into a heavy, suffocating snow, muffling the Horseshoe Valley in a shroud of deceptive peace. Inside the hollowed-out fortress, the air was warm, smelling of cedar oil, and the clean metallic scent of the copper pipes radiating heat from the stone stove. Arthur sat in the darkness, his back pressed against the curved wall of the interior. He wore his beige canvas jacket zipped to the chin, the fabric feeling like a second skin, and his dark charcoal chinos, never denim, which would have been stiff and noisy, allowed him to move with a fluid, ghost-like grace. His right knee, though still a knot of dull pain, was manageable thanks to the radiant heat. He didn't need to see the intruders. He had his radar. Buster, the 10-year-old German shepherd, was positioned at the center of the log's floor, his massive paws splayed out to catch the subtlest frequency of the earth. In the absolute silence of his world, Buster had become a biological sensor. Suddenly, the dog shifted, his frosted white muzzle lifting an inch from the wood. He didn't bark, but he moved toward Arthur, placing a heavy, warm paw directly onto Arthur's charcoal-clad thigh. It was a single, firm press, the signal for front left. Arthur reached for his iron pry bar, the cold metal of familiar comfort. He knew exactly what was happening outside. Captain Elias Reed was a professional, but he was a man of modern warfare, reliant on optics and electronics that the freezing Umpqua mist was currently rendering useless. Along with Reed and the twitchy tracker Kalen, a third figure had appeared in the clearing. Jax, a man built like a concrete pillar. Jax was the team's breacher, standing nearly 6'5" with a shaved head that bore the jagged scars of a close-range shrapnel blast. His arms, thick as Arthur's thighs, were covered in faded tactical tattoos, and he wore a heavy, reinforced plate carrier over a black thermal suit. Jax was a man of silence and brute force, his eyes possessing a dull, predatory flatness that suggested he had long ago discarded his conscience. He carried a heavy, short-handled sledgehammer and a pair of tactical bolt cutters, moving with a surprising, heavy-footed silence that might have fooled a man with hearing but not a dog that felt the ground. The first trap hit just as the mercs reached the basalt spine leading to the log's entrance. Kalen, eager to prove his worth, stepped onto a section of moss-covered rock that Arthur had meticulously coated in a mixture of pine resin and wet clay. In the freezing sleet, the surface had become as slick as a glacier. Kalen's boot lost its purchase instantly. He didn't even have time to shout before he was sliding down the basalt incline toward the ravine. He crashed into a thicket of vine maple, the metallic clack of his drop tablet echoing through the valley. Reed and Jax froze, their weapons raised, but there was no target to shoot. The forest remained a wall of emerald shadows. Reed signaled Jax to move to the right, attempting a pincer movement on the log. Arthur, feeling Buster's chin nudge his boot twice, two targets slid into the narrow gap near the log's entrance door. He didn't use a firearm. He didn't want the muzzle flash to give away his position, and more importantly, he didn't want to break the silence that was his greatest weapon. Jax approached the side of the fallen giant, his sledgehammer raised to crush the bark-covered door. He stepped over a fallen branch, unaware that the branch was the trigger for Arthur's primary deadfall. As Jax's heavy boot compressed the moss, the tension release mechanism Arthur had engineered from cedar heartwood and rusted wire snapped with the sound of a whip. A heavy section of hemlock log, suspended 10 feet in the air by a counterweight system, swung down in a silent, lethal arc. It hit Jax squarely in the chest, the impact sounding like a wet sack of grain hitting a floor. The massive man was thrown backward 10 feet into the snow, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged gasp. He wasn't dead, but his ribs were shattered, and his tactical vest was the only thing that had saved his heart from stopping. Reed, seeing his breacher go down to a primitive trap, felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in decades. Genuine hesitation. He was a man who understood ballistics and satellite imagery, not the ancient vengeful physics of the forest. Inside the log, Arthur felt the vibration of Jax hitting the ground, a heavy, resonant thud that traveled through the roots of the cedar. He looked at Buster, whose amber eyes were fixed on the door. The dog's body was a coiled spring, his white muzzle twitching. Buster suddenly lunged toward the rear of the log, nudging Arthur's hand with his head. Movement from behind. Reed had abandoned the front entrance and was attempting to climb onto the top of the massive trunk, hoping to drop down through the hollow branch Silas had used as a chimney. Arthur smiled a grim soldier's smile. He had anticipated the high ground maneuver. As Reed's boots crunched onto the bark above Arthur's head, Arthur pulled a secondary lever, a simple sliding wooden bolt Silas had installed years ago for a different reason. The chimney branch, which Arthur had intentionally loosened and greased with resin, suddenly gave way under Reed's weight. The mercenary captain plummeted through the opening, his legs dangling into the hollow interior of the log. Arthur didn't wait for him to recover. He moved with a speed that defied his injury, pinning Reed's legs against the internal cedar wall with a heavy wooden bracing bar. Reed was stuck, half in and half out of the log, his tactical rifle out of reach in the snow outside. Arthur stepped into the dim orange light of the stone stove, the shadows lengthening his angular jaw and the scar on his temple. He held the sharpened iron pry bar at Reed's throat, the point just grazing the captain's tactical collar. "The black box isn't for you, Reed." Arthur's voice was a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to come from the heart of the tree itself. "It belongs to the men your master murdered. Tell Marcus Thorne that the signal he tried to kill 50 years ago just went live." Reed stared up at the man in the beige canvas jacket. seeing not a homeless veteran, but a ghost of the Kunar Valley, a man who had mastered the art of survival in a world that had forgotten him. Reed, realizing the tactical situation was a total loss, Jax crippled, Kalen lost in the ravine, and himself pinned like a specimen, closed his eyes. "You think this ends with us?" Reed whispered. Arthur didn't answer. He simply signaled Buster, who had approached Reed with a low, menacing rumble in his chest that the merc felt in his very marrow. Arthur stripped Reed of his sidearm and communications gear, tossing them into the hearth's fire. He then released the bracing bar, allowing Reed to fall into the interior of the log, where the merc lay gasping on the floorboards. Arthur didn't kill him. He was an engineer, not an executioner. He bound Reed's hands with the same high tensile wire he'd used for the traps and dragged him toward the Faraday cage he'd built for Buster. "You'll stay here until the storm passes," Arthur said, his voice cold and final. "Then you'll take your men and you'll tell Thorn that the forest is closed. If he sends more, the trees will eat them too." As the night deepened and the snow continued to bury the valley, Arthur sat back down by the stove, his hand resting on Buster's head. The phantom static was gone. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't a threat. It was his victory. The morning after the siege of the log fortress dawned, with a clarity that felt almost divine. The sky a polished sapphire bowl inverted over the snow-dusted ridges of the Umpqua. Inside the hollowed western red cedar, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and victory, a stark contrast to the bruised and bound men sitting in the corner near the copper-heated sleeping platform. Arthur stood by the stone stove, his beige canvas jacket zipped tight and his dark charcoal chinos, stained with the soot of battle but still sturdy, reflecting the flickering orange light. He didn't look like a man who had just dismantled a professional mercenary team. He looked like a weary sentry who had finally seen the sun rise after a long night on the perimeter. His right knee throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but the radiant heat from the floorboards kept the joint from locking. Beside him, Buster stood with his frosted white muzzle resting on Arthur's thigh, his amber eyes fixed on the satellite communications array Arthur had seized from Captain Reed's tactical vest. Arthur's large calloused fingers worked the device with a precision he hadn't used in years, bypassing the encrypted corporate locks to find a frequency that belonged to the world of law and honor, not the shadows of Marcus Thorne. The first person to respond to Arthur's signal wasn't the local sheriff, but a specialized unit within the Department of Justice that Thomas Sterling's old letters had hinted at. 2 hours later, the silence of the valley was broken by the rhythmic, heavy thumping of a Black Hawk helicopter descending into the horseshoe clearing. Out of the craft stepped Special Agent Sarah Miller, a woman who seemed to embody the very essence of quiet, relentless justice. Sarah was in her late 40s, tall and slender, with a posture that suggested she had spent years carrying the weight of the difficult truths. Her hair was a striking salt and pepper, pulled back into a tight, professional bun, and her skin was pale, save for a light dusting of freckles across a nose that had been broken and reset at some point in her career. She wore a dark navy tactical jacket over a simple gray sweater, her eyes a piercing, intelligent green that seemed to catalog every detail of Arthur's fortress in a single sweep. Sarah was known for her work in the Cold Case Military Division, a woman of profound empathy who had lost her own father to a bureaucratic cover-up during the Gulf War, an event that had forged her into a shield for the forgotten. Following Sarah was General Raymond Graves, a retired 4-star officer who had been a young lieutenant under Silas Vance's command decades ago. Graves was a man built like an old mountain, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, with a thick mane of snow-white hair and a neatly trimmed white beard that framed a jawline of granite. He walked with a heavy, authoritative gait, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of shock and reverence as he looked at the hollowed-out tree. Graves had spent 30 years trying to reconcile the Silas Vance he knew, the man who had taught him how to lead, with the traitor the records described. When Arthur presented the tin box, the yellow journals, and the signed affidavits of the Blackwood Ridge survivors, Graves didn't just read them. He devoured them. The general's hands shook as he touched the photograph of Silas and Thomas Sterling. "We looked for him," Graves whispered, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that Buster felt through the floor. "The signals were always blocked. We thought the forest had taken him." Arthur stood tall, his hand resting on Buster's head, and replied simply, "The forest didn't take him, General. It protected him. It waited for the truth to be ready. The fallout from the discovery was a seismic event that rippled through the highest corridors of power. As Sarah Miller's team carefully cataloged the Blackwood black box, the evidence of Marcus Thorne's decades-long deception became undeniable. Thorne, now an elderly and influential figure in private defense contracting, was apprehended within 48 hours, his legacy of aristocratic arrogance dismantled by the words of a man who had lived in a tree. The national media descended on the Umpqua, hungry for the story of the hermit engineer and the ghost of Blackwood Ridge. Arthur, however, remained within the sanctuary of the log, refusing to step into the glare of the cameras. He sat by the stone stove, feeding small chips of cedar into the fire, while Buster slept at his feet, undisturbed by the world he could no longer hear. The phantom static in Arthur's head was gone, replaced by a profound, echoing peace. He had fulfilled his father's mission. He had paid the sterling debt. A week later, Agent Miller and General Graves returned to the valley with an official decree. The United States Army had formally exonerated Silas Vance, posthumously restoring his rank and awarding him the Silver Star for his actions at Blackwood Ridge. More importantly, the government offered Arthur a massive settlement, a reward for the recovery of the classified intelligence and a correction for the decades of neglect his family had suffered. Arthur stood at the entrance of the log, the winter sun warming his beige canvas jacket, and looked out at the ancient trees that had been his only allies. He looked at Sarah Miller, whose green eyes were soft with respect, and then at the old dog beside him. "I don't want the money," Arthur said, his voice firm and clear. "I spent my life in cities that didn't have room for people like me. I don't need a house with 4 walls and a roof that leaks noise." Instead, Arthur made a counter-proposal that would change the map of the Oregon wilderness forever. He requested that the entire Horseshoe Valley and the surrounding 5,000 acres be designated as the Silas Vance Wilderness Preserve, a protected sanctuary where no logging or development could ever touch the ancient giants. He then directed the entirety of the settlement funds toward the construction of the Sterling Vance Center for Transition, a specialized facility built at the edge of the preserve. It wasn't to be a hospital or a barracks, but a place of healing designed by an engineer's mind. The center would provide veterans struggling with PTSD a place to learn the honest trades of woodworking and forest management, a place where the silence of the trees could do for them what it had done for Arthur. He insisted that the center be run by people like Sarah Miller, those who understood that a soldier's wounds aren't always visible. As the first snows of January began to fall, Arthur watched from the door of the hollowed cedar as the first team of conservationists arrived to survey the land. He wasn't leaving the log, not yet. He had work to do. He began to carve a new set of handles for his tools, the grain of the wood smooth and honest under his fingers. He had become the unofficial warden of the valley, a man who lived between the world of men and the world of the forest. Buster, now comfortable in his expanded Faraday cage, watched the birds through the entrance, his amber eyes bright with a new, calm energy. Arthur realized that he wasn't a broken fragment of a war anymore. He was the architect of a new peace. He looked at the photograph of his father and Silas on the hearth, their faces now clear of the shadows of betrayal. The signal had finally been sent, the mission was complete, and for the first time in 48 years, Arthur Sterling knew exactly where he belonged. A year had passed since the atmospheric river had nearly swallowed the Umpqua wilderness, and the December air now carried a crisp, clean scent of fresh pine and wood smoke, rather than the metallic tang of an impending disaster. On the southern edge of the Silas Vance Wilderness Preserve, nestled just where the ancient giants of the forest gave way to a sun-drenched meadow, stood a structure that looked more like a cathedral than a workshop. It was built from reclaimed cedar and local basalt, its wide windows catching the golden winter light. Above the heavy oak doors hung a sign carved with meticulous precision from a lightning-struck branch of the original log fortress. Buster and Wood, Estro 2025. Inside, the air was a warm, fragrant symphony of cedar shavings, beeswax, and the steady, rhythmic rasp of hand planes. The high-frequency phantom static that had once ruled Arthur's mind was long gone, replaced by the honest, grounding acoustics of creation. Arthur stood at the central workbench, his silhouette still as rugged and immovable as the timber he worked with. At 49, he seemed to have shed the heavy mantle of the fugitive, his flint-colored eyes now possessing a depth of peace that had been absent for decades. He was dressed in his signature uniform of healing, a clean beige canvas jacket over a perfectly pressed beige button-up shirt, paired with his solid dark charcoal chinos. He had never returned to denim. He still found the texture of jeans to be a dissonant note in his quiet life, preferring the smooth, quiet reliability of his chinos. His silver-gray stubble was neatly trimmed, and the scar on his temple had faded into a silver line of pride. Beside him, leaning against his leg with the familiarity of a heartbeat, was Buster. The old German shepherd was now 11, his muzzle almost entirely white, and his tattered ear a badge of honor that everyone in the valley recognized. Buster was still deaf, but he reigned over the workshop as its silent sentinel, his paws splayed on the heated floorboards Arthur had designed, so the old dog could feel the vibration of every student's footsteps. One of those students was Leo Aris, a 24-year-old former Marine who had arrived at the center 3 months prior. Leo was a young man of hauntingly lean proportions, his buzzed hair revealing a series of small, jagged scars from a roadside blast in a forgotten corner of the world. His skin was pale, his eyes a restless, nervous blue that constantly scanned the room for threats that weren't there. Leo's hands, once steady enough to disassemble a rifle in the dark, had been plagued by a persistent tremor since he returned home, a physical manifestation of the static in his soul. He had spent weeks sitting in silence, unable to even pick up a tool, until Arthur had sat him down and placed a block of raw walnut in his hands. Arthur didn't give him a lecture, he simply showed Leo how to feel the grain, how to listen to the wood through the tips of his fingers. Today, Leo was working on a dovetail joint for a small memory chest, his brow furrowed in concentration. The tremor was almost gone, his movements now following the rhythmic, meditative instruction Arthur had provided. Leo was the first of many, a young soldier finding his way back to the world through the grain of the forest. Also present in the workshop was Grace Miller, the daughter of Special Agent Sarah Miller, who had taken a year-long sabbatical from her architectural studies to help manage the center's operations. Grace was 22, a woman of vibrant energy with hair the color of copper, and a constellation of freckles across her nose that mirrored her mother's. She wore a heavy wool sweater and work boots, her presence a bridge between the clinical world of the Department of Justice and the tactile world of the workshop. Grace was a person of immense patience, her laughter a soft, musical sound that seemed to soothe the jagged nerves of the men in the room. She was currently organizing a collection of Silas Vance's original blueprints, which had been digitized and displayed in a glass-walled museum area at the back of the shop. Grace had been the one to insist that Silas's story be the heart of the center, ensuring that every veteran who walked through the doors knew they were standing on a foundation of restored honor. The Buster and Wood Workshop was more than just a business. It was a living ecosystem of recovery. Arthur had turned the settlement funds into a trust that ensured no veteran would ever be turned away for lack of money. They made furniture for the local community, pieces that were sought after for their incredible durability and the soul they seemed to possess. Arthur taught them that every knot in the wood was a story of survival, every scar a point of strength. He mentored them with a quiet, sergeant-like discipline, his voice never rising above a calm, steady rumble. He was no longer the man who lived in a garage in Tacoma, hiding from the world. He was the man who had invited the world into his sanctuary, teaching them that the silence of the forest wasn't something to fear, but something to inhabit. As the sun began to dip behind the ridges, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and gold across the valley, the students began to pack away their tools. There was a sense of camaraderie that transcended the military branch they had served in, a shared language of sawdust and sweat. Arthur watched them leave, offering a nod of approval to Leo, whose dovetail joint was nearly perfect. Once the workshop was empty and the only sound was the crackle of the fire in the basalt hearth, Arthur reached for his beige canvas jacket and signaled to Buster. The dog didn't need to hear. He felt the shift in Arthur's energy. He stood up, his tail giving a single, heavy thud against the floor, and followed Arthur out the door. They didn't go to a house in the town or a modern apartment at the center. Instead, they walked into the deepening shadows of the Silas Vance Wilderness Preserve. The path was well worn, but still felt like a secret. They hiked for 20 minutes, Arthur's right knee holding firm, thanks to the daily physical therapy of the woods. They reached the Horseshoe Valley just as the first stars began to pierce the velvet sky. In the center of the clearing lay the fallen giant, the western red cedar that had been their first home. It was no longer a hidden secret, it was a monument. A simple bronze plaque near the root system read, "The Silas Vance Fortress, a place of honor." Arthur had maintained the log with the same technical precision he used for his furniture. The bark seals were fresh, the stone chimney puffed a welcoming curl of smoke, and the Faraday cage inside was now lined with the finest wool blankets. They entered the log, the air inside immediately warm and familiar, smelling of the pine resin and copper-heated cedar Arthur had engineered a year ago. Arthur sat on the floor, leaning back against the curved wall, and Buster immediately settled beside him, resting his heavy white muzzle on Arthur's charcoal-clad thigh. This was their ritual. No matter how many people they helped or how many buildings they raised, they always returned to the tree. It was the only place where the silence felt absolute, where the ghosts of Silas and Thomas Sterling felt like guardian spirits rather than haunting memories. Arthur took a small, silver-framed photograph from his pocket, the photo of Silas and his father, and placed it on the hearth. He looked at Buster, and the dog gave a long, contented sigh, his amber eyes closing in the dim orange light. The war was over. The debt was paid. The phantom static had been permanently silenced by the steady, purposeful heartbeat of a life built on honor and timber. In the heart of the fallen tree, Arthur Sterling finally closed his eyes, no longer a broken fragment, but a man who had found his home. The journey of Arthur and Buster reminds us that no soul is too broken to be rebuilt, and no legacy is too buried to be redeemed. What began as a desperate flight from the noise of the city became a divine appointment in the heart of the Oregon wilderness. Through the silence of a hollowed cedar, a veteran found his purpose, a loyal dog found his peace, and a community found a sanctuary for healing. Life often brings storms that strip away everything we once relied on, our homes, our health, or our hope. But remember, sometimes God allows the old trees to fall so that we can find the hidden fortresses He prepared for us long ago. Miracles rarely arrive in bright lights or loud fanfares. They often wait in the quiet, steady heartbeat of a loyal friend or the honest grain of a piece of wood. If you are fighting an invisible battle today, know that you are not alone. Your scars are not signs of weakness, but blueprints for your future strength. Every fallen tree in your life has the potential to become a shelter for someone else.